Everybody, welcome to this video series. We have, I think, a really cool compliance brief to provide today. A little bit of background and context. So Sawyer and I, we help lead the ISO practice here at Risk 360, and we've done over 1,000 ISO 27001 assessments. And what we've done through our platform, fullCircle, is we've consolidated and reviewed a lot of those findings and found some very interesting trends, both macroeconomically, but also detailed in the different controls and some gap areas. And we've consolidated those trends. And what we hope to do is kind of provide you a back brief on what we're seeing. That way, if you're thinking about ISO 27001 for the first time, you have a guidebook on some of the common pitfalls. And probably more likely is if you have an existing ISO program, you have a checklist of things to think about as you try to maintain your program this year and going into the next year. So we'll provide all of those. And we have a quick roadmap here. There's a quick executive summary. If you're watching this on YouTube right now, you can look at the link in the description here, and you can download this whole presentation. And I think that executive summary will be a really good quick checklist of things that you'll see. We'll also embed this video, so if you want to share this out through that downloadable, you can. Then we're going to walk through 12 detailed insights. There's kind of 3 macro trends that we'll talk about, and then 9 control areas that we see as very common gaps. Then we're going to talk about 4 action items, so things that you can do now to improve your program or address some of these trends that we're seeing. And then lastly, we'll share some additional resources for our ISO library. We have a series called ISO Bytes. We have some free downloadables, and we'll link to those, and you can also see those in the description. So as you want those resources, or if you want to share them with your team, you can do that. So next up, we'll talk about the executive summary. I'm just going to flash this because we're going to talk about each of these in detail. But these are 9 of the areas. We'll talk about gaps we're seeing around the ISMS. We'll talk about third-party risk management, some of the things we're seeing around pen testing, business continuity, key management, access control, risk assessments, and vulnerability management. Those are all the usual suspects. Those are things you're probably very familiar with. We looked at well over 10,000 gaps in those, and we'll talk about what we're seeing specifically, what are resulting in gaps, and how severe those gaps and things that you can do about them. So that's kind of our journey for today. So let's hop into those detailed insights and get some thoughts here. So from a macroeconomic perspective, this isn't specific to ISO. This is probably more specific to security programs overall. And one of the things that we're seeing this is September of 2024. Over the last 18 months to 2 years, if you were to go back 18 months or 2 years, we were kind of in an environment where the budgets for security programs were just growing rapidly. You can see the screenshot on the page. They were growing by 18%, 17%. They were growing well faster than the market. And what we were seeing as a result is security team members were adding new frameworks, secure certification options. They were adding team members. We were buying tools. And in some cases, just weren't being as judicious with the spend as we could be. Those were exciting times for security teams. And then there was an economic shift where last year in 2023 and this year, we saw a pretty significant reduction in budgets, at least the growth of budgets. So they grew 6% and 8% respectively over the last couple of years, which was probably about inflationary, maybe even a little bit below inflation. So that probably didn't even account for salary adjustments in many instances. And I think we're all feeling that. So what companies are asking us to do is really focus on efficiency and cost reduction. And some of the strategies we're going to talk about in this presentation is what can you do to maintain your ISO program or even improve your ISO program in a world where you have to reduce cost and be efficient. I'm part of a CEO mastermind group called Simple Numbers, and they look at some macroeconomic data. And one of the interesting things that they said, looking at the data, is about 1/3 of companies are down. They're actually losing revenue. About 1/3 of companies are flat, and about 1/3 of companies are up. So there's a very big chance that your organization is actually down on revenue, and you have to focus on cost containment. That's new based on 18 or 24 months ago when everyone was up in revenue. If you want to see some more information on the budget numbers and where we got this screenshot, you can check out the IAN's budget report, which I think is really cool. They did a survey of some of the budgets. So that's just kind of what we're seeing, something to think about as you're planning for next year. Sawyer, anything you want to add to this? Anything you're seeing in terms of like planning for the security teams?
Yeah, there's definitely a desire to drive efficiency and contain costs in the teams we're working with. It comes in a lot of different forms. It manifests in different ways, but you could just feel that common thread across a lot of the customers.
Yep. So just know it's not just you. Take that into consideration as you're planning. So what can you do? So we want to present some strategies and the next couple of macro trends, things to think about to handle this big economic swing that we're seeing. The next thing we're seeing that we think can help you with the cost reduction efforts is if you're managing multiple frameworks, you need to think about how to do that very efficiently, especially if you're managing multiple ISO frameworks. So, historically, what we have seen is organizations will have multiple security frameworks like SOC 2, like ISO, PCI, multiple ISO frameworks themselves, and they'll handle them all separately in different audit work streams. In some cases, they're even using different audit firms. They're managing them across products. So instead of having one audit lifecycle with, let's say, 100 evidence requests and 100 controls, you might have 6 of those. And that has resulted in a whole lot of costs. And we think that there's a huge opportunity for you to harmonize your audit work streams and create what's called an integrated management system. And if you can do that, you can harmonize your controls. For example, if you have a policy control for each framework, you can harmonize it and have one policy control, one policy evidence request. You can also create what we'll talk about in a second, which is called an integrated management system to provide a whole lot of efficiency. That's kind of our bread and butter over here at Risk 360. There's a white paper called the Single Framework Strategy that you can download. We'll link to that in the comments here if you'd like. And our whole platform, fullCircle, is based on that. We're having a whole lot of success in helping organizations reduce their audit burden and their budget there. So just think about that as a strategy headed into next year. Sawyer, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, one of the biggest things is sort of a trend I'm noticing is a lot of companies used to manage their, we'll call them core compliance frameworks, such as ISO 27001 or SOC 2, things your customers required you to have, separate from their maturity frameworks, such as like CIS. Um, and I'm starting to see companies try to bring those together because that's untapped efficiency. And while those controls and those maturity frameworks can sometimes be more prescriptive and specific, they actually tend to fit fairly nicely with these foundational frameworks like ISO 27001. So I'm definitely seeing additional pressure, I guess, to bring together those sort of foundational must-haves and those nice-to-have maturity frameworks.
Yep. So, we're talking about our 12 detailed findings. Our first 3 are macroeconomic. We talked about number 1 is this economic trend of economic pressure, cost reduction, cost containment. One of the solutions to that is this one: managing multiple compliance frameworks, trying to harmonize them to make them more efficient. And our third and final kind of macro trend that we're seeing out there that you might find interesting is the adoption of GRC platforms. So ultimately, what we're saying is to be able to pull off the efficiency, to reduce that audit burden, to harmonize your frameworks. You can do that in an Excel spreadsheet. We've seen people try it and do it, but it's not really tenable. You can't do that across too many frameworks. If you have employee turnover and they don't understand the Excel spreadsheet or the strategy, it gets lost there. And it's just really hard to do. So if you're looking for ways to automate evidence gathering, uh, to be a better accountability partner to your team when it comes to operating the controls and gathering evidence, if you're looking for ways to map multiple compliance frameworks or to add new compliance framework as your program gets more complex, we really think that it's important for you to consider adopting a GRC platform. And of course, we have a bias here. Our preferred GRC platform is fullCircle, especially if you're managing a complex GRC program with multiple frameworks, multiple products, multiple business units, where there's nuances like different audit periods. Maybe you're managing hundreds of different control owners and thousands of pieces of audit evidence. We think fullCircle is the best. If you're a startup watching this and maybe you only do one framework like ISO, that you might want to use a different platform that really focuses in on plug and play audit evidence gathering. But for the larger, more complex organizations, that probably isn't going to work for you. Highly encourage you to consider fullCircle, but any GRC platform is definitely a good starting point. And of course, I'm sure if you're in this industry, you know this is a big trend. Sawyer, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just touching on those control harmonizations, it can be a very big efficiency gain if you're able to pull those together in a GRC platform and manage a single framework of controls that addresses multiple, compliance frameworks. But it can also be a big time suck. I've seen a lot of companies sort of spin their wheels trying to map controls because you can always get too specific or too broad. But the biggest thing I would encourage is either seek out a partner like us that can help you with that, or if you're going to do it in house, really take some time and think about subjectively where you want to land, because it's not an exact science, but it is still very necessary to get it right so that the program can run.
Cool. So those are the three macro trends. Again, cost containment, cost reduction, managing multiple frameworks, and adoption of a GRC platform. Those are the three big picture trends that we're seeing, agnostic of ISO, but certainly relevant to ISO frameworks. Now, what we want to do is this is, I think, really fun, is dive into the findings. So a little bit of background: all of our clients at Risk 360, we have several hundred over the last few years, who we have done the assessments using our platform, fullCircle. So there's literally thousands or a couple thousand assessments in there, tens of thousands of audit findings. And what we have done is compiled them and said, where are our clients having issues, and why are they having those issues? So that's what we're going to dive into now. So by far and away, the number one area that we found in terms of audit gaps is around the information security management system. So you want to hop in here and talk about these trends?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll add another just piece of context. We felt it would be useful to focus on 27001 because it is, in a lot of cases, sort of that backbone framework. Companies start with something as comprehensive as ISO 27001 and then build on top of it. And we believe if you get this one right, it can get you a lot further along in some of those others that you may be planning for later. So we felt it would be good to really hone in and focus on this one framework for this. But yeah, the ISMS. So if you're familiar with ISO, you know that clauses 4 through 10 is essentially what you're being certified against in the 27001 document. And so it's the best way to describe it is clauses 4 through 10, or the ISMS, is the governance of your program. In addition to that, you have your Annex A controls, and we'll dive into all the findings from there as well. But unsurprisingly, the ISMS findings are, as Christian said, by far and away the most common gaps we see. And the reason why is because these requirements touch on what your leadership team should be doing, the type of visibility you should have, the ways you should be measuring the program. It looks at, are you doing risk assessments correctly, or comprehensively rather. It looks at a lot of the things that are inputs and outputs to your program versus do access controls well, right? So that's more of like an Annex A control. So there's a lot of requirements in clauses 4 through 10, but they're not listed out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's sort of paragraph format. You have to read through it. You have to understand the narrative, the philosophy. So again, unsurprisingly, a lot of clients, especially those going through this for the first time, they run into some gaps here.
Yep.
And so it's always best to read that document thoroughly. It's only about 10 pages or so for these clauses, but there's a lot packed in there.
Yeah, and just for a little more context, about half the external audit in terms of evidence request walkthroughs is covering your ISMS. People get really focused in on the
Mm-hmm.
controls, which is called Annex A, about 100 controls, whereas most of the audit itself is covering the ISMS. And they're kind of written in paragraph format. So there's things like you have to document the context of the organization, internal
Mm-hmm.
and external stakeholders. You have to talk about how you do a risk assessment and keep a risk register. So there's all these little nuanced requirements in there. And unless you take the time to really understand them and then implement them in a meaningful way, you'll probably result in gaps. The other little thing I want to throw out there is that external auditors are just really good at auditing the ISMS. So there's this balance between what is easy to audit, but also important to the framework. And the ISMS happens to hit both of those areas. So auditors spend a whole
Mm-hmm.
lot of time here. So don't underestimate this. This can seem like a paper program. It can seem like just documentation, but it's extremely important in reality to your risk management program, but also to your ability to achieve certification.
Yep, absolutely. Cool. All right. So the top 5 ISMS gaps really sort of showed how difficult it is to interpret the standard sometimes. So you see on the right hand side, we've got what those top 5 most common gaps are. It's the ISMS scope, which clause 4 is all about, as Christian said, context of the organization. So that's why are you building this program? What are your drivers? Who cares about it? Who are your stakeholders internally and externally? What are the boundaries and scope of the system, et cetera? So clauses 4.3 and 4.4 sort of go hand in hand, because 4.4 is really the documentation of 4.1 through 4.3. 5.2, again, this one also is not surprising. I do think companies get a little too centered on this one sometimes, which is policies and procedures. Yes, you must have policies and procedures that define your program, and the standard will tell you where you need a specific policy versus a more, just generic implementation of a control. But I do think companies get a little bit too caught up in writing policies and procedures and thinking that's going to get them over the finish line. In reality, you have to implement those policies, and those procedures have to reflect reality. Sometimes you can write yourself into a corner because you're writing for best practice and future state, but in reality, the control owners are not doing things that way, and so that in and of itself is a gap. So be careful what you define for yourself. Clause 4.1 we talked about, and then clause 6.2 is setting the information security objectives and planning to achieve them. So a lot of times we set business objectives, we then go out and build tactics with our various teams, but we sort of miss that in between step with compliance and security programs, where we need to define what we're trying to get done with the program and how we're going to measure that and make sure that we're making progress in the right direction. The standard's very explicit about that, and if done right, it can really help you set a good vision for your team. Christian's got a great book that he wrote that talks about sort of this idea of getting everyone on the same page and sort of rowing in the same direction, as I've heard him say. So that's a good resource there if you're looking for ways to think about security objectives.
Yep. One thing I just want to point out is, like, we're in the details here. We're talking about sub clauses and things like that. But a full 3,000 of the 8,000 came from just these 5 sub clauses.
That's right.
So if you're thinking about what you should do, I hope the thing you're taking away from this is that the ISMS is important, and that you need to go clause by clause and sub clause by sub clause and make sure you're addressing in writing all of these different things.
Yeah.
Because that's a bad reason to get a gap on an ISO assessment, but you will get a gap if you don't have those documented. So as part of your kind of readiness checklist as you're going through, which we'll have a whole readiness checklist that we'll talk about here in a minute, but it really should be someone doing the painstaking work of going clause by clause, thinking through them, and making sure that you have every clause documented. It is not fun work, but it is necessary work and mandatory to get certification.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about the next one, third-party risk.
Absolutely. So third-party risk is, as you would imagine, it's security due diligence on your vendors, right? So your stakeholders, particularly customers, have trusted you to process their data securely. You sometimes then trust other third parties to sub-process that data securely. And so this control set is really all around making sure that the companies and vendors you're using to do that are as secure as you are. And so there's a few controls around that. The biggest thing I've seen come up here is basically defining what security requirements are for your vendors. A lot of times we get through the contracting process and maybe it's on their paper, maybe it's on yours, but there's not a great story to tell around what is required of them from a security perspective, because a lot of times they're solving a real critical business problem. You need to just get the thing over the finish line, and it can get a little bit rushed. So if you find yourself with contracts that have not really defined this super well, I would encourage you to sit down and come up with, at a minimum, a boilerplate set of requirements that are must-haves for your vendors. That can help you with a lot of these other controls as well. And then the other big thing I was going to mention is just execution of doing those reviews. Sometimes it's unwieldy because you've got so many vendors. Depends on the size of the organization, but the more vendors you have, the more reviews you might have to do. I would encourage you to take a risk-based approach there. Really identify who are truly my critical and high-risk vendors, and maybe look at those more often than maybe those low and moderate risk vendors.
Yeah. Especially if you're an organization that's kind of large, like you might have thousands of vendors, or maybe you're onboarding hundreds per year. That's where we see most of the gaps, where your organization simply does not have a process to assess those vendors as they're coming through the system or assess them annually. and you need to think through how you're going to handle that. And the other reason it's complex is because often it's cross functional. It's not just the security team; it's probably also legal and also the
Hmm.
procurement department. So when multiple parties are responsible, things fall through the gaps. And this is also easy to audit. Like it's really easy for an auditor to come in
Yeah.
and audit this. So we
Well,
often see gaps there.
and to that point, I've seen so many times companies just put down on paper, we will audit all vendors annually. And then as an auditor, you have to validate that that's happening because that's a rule you've set for yourself in policy. So that's why I say really think this one through and decide what makes business sense. Do I really want to audit all my vendors every year? Probably not. So sit down and come up with some definitions and ways to develop a sensible approach that's based on risk.
Absolutely.
All right.
Let's talk
Pen
pen testing.
testing. Yeah. So this one, sometimes it's as simple as we didn't do a pen test. We just didn't have one. Sometimes it's a little more complicated in that maybe they're doing some pen tests, but those pen tests are finding gaps that aren't getting remediated on time. Sometimes it's that specific parts of your build process for software are not going through security tests of any type, and you're not doing application pen tests, which would sort of cover that in most cases. So there's a lot of ways you can get gaps around these four controls here. But the biggest thing to keep in mind is understanding what a penetration test is versus a vulnerability scan, and understanding the role that you and either that internal or external pen tester play in each of those scenarios. A scan is typically a tool. It's just a tool that runs a scan and gives you some outputs and findings of vulnerabilities. That's not a pen test. A pen test is taking a human and then typically looking at a similar output, but they're taking it to the nth degree. They're actually exploring, well, what does this actually mean within the context of the business? You know, this server has this vulnerability, but what's on this server? What could this do to the business? How serious is this truly? So you really want to make sure you're not missing that human element there, because that can be really critical. And in fact, it can cause you to waste a lot of money trying to fix vulnerabilities that really aren't going to move the needle that much. So that pen test can be invaluable in addressing some of those goals we talked about earlier, such as saving money and cost
Yep.
containment.
Yeah. One of the things that's important to point out is ISO uh, doesn't use the word pen test. You won't see
That's
that.
right.
What they say instead, in short, is that you need to understand your risk and be doing certain activities to identify and resolve those risks.
Mm-hmm.
And for most technology companies, doing a mission-based penetration test is an essential part to meet those requirements. So understanding, do you need a network pen test versus an app pen test versus something else or something more thorough, getting that assessment done and then doing something to continuously improve. That's the ecosystem that an auditor is working through. And often we'll see a pen test that really wasn't a pen test, it was a vulnerability scan, or we'll see a pen test that didn't even cover the whole scope, or it had findings and those findings were never corrected.
Mm-hmm.
So those are a lot of the common things. So just I really do some deep thinking about what you need to do here and how to create that system of assessing and correcting over time.
Yep. Yeah. So the next one here, I think most everyone knows what business continuity is. I doubt I need to explain, what that looks like. But I started at Risk 360 in 2018, and I distinctly remember a very visible shift in scrutiny levels around continuity programs before and after COVID. And so a lot of companies were heavily impacted by the lack of continuity planning. And it really helped sort of shine a light on the fact that really these controls weren't super mature in a lot of cases. So, but we had been seeing this for years. I mean, we've always audited it the same way. We may ask a few different questions now because we've had some real life examples to test against. But in general, I mean, the controls haven't changed. Even with the 2022 update, the controls didn't really change around this. It's pretty straightforward. You need to have a continuity plan in place. You need to define roles and responsibilities, and you need to make sure that you have specifics documented in the event that something happens. That way, you can actually follow that plan, and then you need to test it. That's really the biggest one there. 17.1.3 is making sure that you're looking at the program, putting it through at least a tabletop exercise of some type, and exercising it to see if this is going to meet our needs in a real situation.
Yep. And then from a business perspective, I think the trap we often fall in, or that I often see, is business continuity can be one of those things that is a total paper program,
Yeah.
and you start to believe adds very little business value until suddenly you wish you
Mm-hmm.
had a business continuity plan. because you
Yeah,
have an
it's
outage or something
insurance.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's insurance. It's homeowners insurance, it's car insurance. I mean, I think a lot of us obviously know the value in those types of things, but it's easy to forget that value until you need it. And when you need it, man, do you need it?
Yeah.
So,
So what I tell folks who are like part of the security or GRC team is, hey, ISO requires it. Use this as an opportunity to like get it done and really
yeah,
think through what adds value to the business, which scenarios could add some true value to the business. Stuff like
yeah,
business email compromise or ransomware
yeah,
or identifying email phishing. Like that stuff adds real business value and can be a little more than just a paper program. So
yeah.
consider that for your team.
Yeah, one of the other things I'll add on that one is thinking about contextual events when you're doing your tabletops. So don't just throw, a hurricane rolls through or everyone has to work from home. Like, think about the implications of what that may mean for your business. So we get hit with ransomware. Well, what specifically got hit with ransomware? What systems are actually affected and what does that do for the business? How does that actually turn into more than just an incident and an actual business continuity event? And so just think about that stuff as you're building this. The more contextual, the more useful it's going to be, and the more value that you're going to get out of it as a business.
Absolutely.
All right, key management. This one is one of my favorite to audit because I have a question that I ask that pretty much always turns into a gap, which is have you documented all of the key types within your organization and what you do with those at the various life cycle stages? And the answer is almost always sort of. So the controls here are really straightforward. You have to have a policy on your use of cryptographic controls. That's where you define things such as the accepted encryption protocols and where you expect encryption to be in place. But then you have key management. So any encryption relies on some version type of a key, right? Even think of your website, right? To go to https.yourcompanyname.com. There's a key involved there. And so you have to define how you're going to manage each of these different keys and what all the different types of keys are throughout their life cycle. And so it's not super difficult. Most of the time, you have people in the business that know exactly what the answers are to this. They just haven't written it down.
Yep. I think the reason this one is often hard for program managers is because it's one of the most technical, and ISO does not provide a lot of detail in
Yeah.
terms of what they're expecting or the implementation guidance. So if you've never been an engineer before, or you're not a security engineer, you're a GRC practitioner trying to implement and provide
Hmm.
guidance on this, it's just really hard. It's like, what in the heck is ISO expecting out of us? But if you talk to your engineering team, they're going to pick up what it's putting down and can help you arrive at a solution here.
Yeah. All right. User access. So I think this one comes up mainly because a lot of companies do a great job onboarding. They provision laptops, they give you the account, they set up your email, they run through their checklist, and then they rarely circle back. So what happens in reality, though, is someone comes on board in your organization, maybe a year, maybe 3 years, who knows? But over time, people change roles, people get promotions, people, you know, uh, take on new responsibilities because maybe there's an acquisition of some type. Bottom line is things change. And so there's really two key controls that have to be executed well to make sure that you're not over provisioning access, which is access creep. And you're also not uh, failing to remove access when things change. And so you should be doing typically at a minimum quarterly access reviews. Certain compliance frameworks require at a minimum quarterly reviews, but your admin rights should be even more often. And so this doesn't necessarily mean you have to sit down and go line by line, every single account, every single permission, every single quarter. Come up with a way to make this sensible. But the bottom line is it needs to be clearly demonstrated that you are reviewing all of the key access in your organization and you're making sure that's appropriate. And you're also putting processes in place so that when job responsibilities change, you're removing and pruning access to keep that access creep at bay.
Yep. Well, one thing I'll point out here is um, at Risk 360, we have an offensive security team. So ethical hackers that do pen testing. And pretty much the number one way that they get access is they get a typical user's account, they compromise that account, and they're able to escalate privileges or that user has access to something that management didn't realize they have access
Yep.
to, and they're able to expand and do things that were unexpected. So this is one of those ones that not only is it a compliance requirement, I think it's also legitimately high risk and something that your organization needs to lock down and think about.
Yeah. Yeah, and it can come out of left field too, especially if you're a startup out there, or maybe you're just growing out of startup phase into a more mature business. You probably have some of those early employees that have access to things you've totally forgotten they have access to, and those can really bite you if they get phished or something like that.
Yep. And if you're an enterprise company, you probably have a whole identity and access management team,
Yeah,
and you know how
yeah,
hard this is.
yeah, exactly. All right, the next one. These are clause requirements, but the risk assessment itself. So a lot of times companies think, well, I did a risk assessment. I documented my list of risks and who owns them, and I put down on paper what we're going to do, and they think they're done with this. In reality, though, the standard calls for some very specific stuff. It basically forces the full life cycle management of a risk. So one common misconception is that a risk typically can go away, that you can resolve a risk. That's usually not the case. Risks are a lot of times the reasons we make money, right? You take risks as a business by processing sensitive data in a special way for a customer. That's key to your business. You can't stop doing that, right? You have to continue doing that thing to provide that service. So what ISO calls for is 611 is the identification of risk. You'll notice that's not on the list because a lot of people get that one right, at least a pretty good try at getting that right. 612 and 613, though, focus on not just the identification, but the true assessment of the risk. What does it mean to us? What do we need to do about it? And the risk treatment. What that means is for every risk, you should identify an owner. You should decide what is my acceptable risk threshold for this type of a thing, and where does this currently sit with the controls I have applied. And if that is too high, you need to mitigate it. Or if it's at or below your acceptable threshold, maybe you accept it. But the bottom line is whatever your formal treatment decision is, that needs to be clearly documented, and you should have the risk treatment owner's approval on that. If it's a mitigation treatment, you need to make sure that you're following up on that periodically and that you are validating that those treatment plans are in fact being executed. Once they get executed, you need to sort of circle back to the top and reassess that risk. Okay, we've brought down maybe the impact or likelihood or both. Is this now acceptable? If not, let's keep remediating, let's keep treating it. If so, document that accordingly. And then clause 8.2 is basically, the standard basically says just execute on the planning you did in clause 6. So clause 6 is all the plans. Clause 8 is the execution of those plans.
Yeah.
So
one thing this is probably the number one thing that people engage Risk 360 to help them with.
Yeah.
Because I think the problem they have is they know they're supposed to do a risk assessment, but they have no practical approach to do one. They're like, what does it do a risk assessment? Is that a controls gap assessment? Is it something else? And if they did try to do a risk assessment on their own, it falls on deaf ears because management sees the findings and they're not needle moving to the business. They don't actually drive results. So this might be one of those ones that engaging an expert makes sense because they can come up with a practical approach and identify stuff that really matters to the business and kind of help you set up that whole program.
Yeah, and I've yet to see a risk assessment scanner, right? There's no tool that you can go pay for and download and run that's going to tell you all your business risks. It just doesn't exist. Like this mandates, requires, it absolutely needs human input to be done right. And so that can be a daunting task if you've never done it, because you feel like maybe you're creating this exhaustive list and you're like, there's 300 things here, this is too much. Maybe you can only come up with a couple of things that you feel like are important. But to Christian's point, a seasoned professional or group like us that's been doing this for a while, we can help you think through that and really focus where you need to focus. Because one thing I tell companies a lot, especially the first time they do this, is a risk assessment needs to be comprehensive, but at the same time, you have limited resources and you're not trying to boil the ocean with this, right? You have to get those top key risks identified and start working on reducing those risks. There may be some risks that, this year we're going to accept this risk with plans to mitigate it next year. That's okay, right? This is an ROI calculation, just like anything else. Misconception is you have to resolve or remediate or make all risks go away or bring them low. That's not necessarily true, right? It's your business. You decide your risk tolerance in certain areas.
Or maybe you're a hospital with 200 business units, or you're a big Fortune 500 company with
Hmm.
50 different products, and you just don't have the resources to do that many risk assessments across your business,
Hmm.
especially in a standard way where the results are consistent. And that's like a whole strategy, and we see gaps around that too. So that's a
Yeah.
different scale of problem, but just something to think through.
Yep. All right. And lastly, here we've got vulnerability management. So we touched on this a little bit, but we wanted to really highlight again how you run your vulnerability management program really, really, really matters. This is probably one of the leading reasons that people get hacked, is because they're not doing a great job with vulnerability management. And the reason why is because you can be completely inundated with the results. I mean, you can be a team of 50 people and your scan comes back with 6,000 gaps or 6,000 vulnerabilities on, your AWS infrastructure. And you're sitting there scratching your head saying, well, what do I really need to work on here? And I'm not saying it's easy. You have to, I mean, this is why there's technical people in the field that this is all they do is they run vulnerability management programs. But the bottom line is you need to come up with a way to identify those vulnerabilities, acknowledge they're there, prioritize them based on risk to your business, and demonstrate through rescans that you've actually fixed the issues. If you're not doing all those things, there's a good chance you'll probably have a gap here.
Yep. And I want to point out there's only 685 gaps, but they're centered around one or two controls.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of just number of controls with gaps, this is one of the highest that we have.
Yep.
So let me jump in real quick to actions that you need to take now. So we've talked about those three macro trends. We talked about 9 or so different detailed results in terms of ISO findings. So what can you do about it? So number one thing that you can do is we think that you should spot check your program. So if you're looking at this text might be a little bit small, but you can download this if you click the link below. And for each of these major gaps, we've given you just a couple simple things that you should do as part of your readiness preparation to get ready for an external audit. So download this, go through that checklist ahead of your external audit, and resolve those gaps if you can. You can also consider this if you're engaging in internal audit, which is clause 9.2. How can you make your internal audit most effective? What are some of the things that you can focus on? We think these are some of those things. Next thing I want to point out is just maintaining your program. We have a pretty good success rate for organizations when they do their ISO program the first year. They're very enthusiastic that first year. They're staffing up for it. It has all of management's attention. Then head into the second and third year and beyond, they have staff turnover. People get burnt out. Management's not excited about maintaining it anymore. You don't have a system to maintain the program, and it falls off, and people lose certification or have a bunch of gaps. Sawyer and I did a whole video on what you should do to maintain your program. We'll link that in the comments, or you can scan the QR code. I think it's a huge amount of value for you to think through how to do that. And we're eating our own dog food here because not only do we consult on this, we have an ISO program. We're in our fourth year of maintaining our program, and it's the exact playbook that we use to maintain our own program, and fullCircle, the platform that we manage our own program in. Next thing is talking about just building an integrated management system. So one thing a lot of people don't know about ISO programs is if you're doing ISO 27001, ISO 9001, ISO 27701, almost all ISO frameworks, they have something in common, and that is the management system, the clauses 4 through 10. They're very, very similar. So if you have multiple ISO programs, you can create what is called an integrated management system. So for example, us here at Risk 360, we have an integrated management system for ISO 27001 that's security, ISO 27701 that's privacy, and ISO 22301, which is business continuity. So if you're currently managing those ISO programs separately, huge opportunity to streamline your program, consolidate auditors, consolidate your team in managing that program with an integrated management system. So if you've never heard that term before, look it up, research it, and see if you can implement that.
Yeah. And one thing I'll add here, you don't have to combine everything all over the place, right? Sometimes it makes more sense. Sometimes it makes more sense to keep them separate. So if you're doing 9001, for example, you're probably not going to find a ton of efficiencies around clause 8 because it's rather different. But 27001 and 9001 require a top management review. you might could knock both out in the same meeting with those top leaders. So don't feel like to integrate it, it's this crazy huge effort that has to be done all or nothing. You can take baby steps over time to mature it, and that's what we do with a lot of our clients.
Yeah, absolutely. And then action item number 4 for you to consider is, in addition to creating an integrated management system, see if you can harmonize ISO across your other frameworks. The most common harmonization that we see is ISO 27001 and SOC 2, followed closely with things like PCI and HIPAA. A lot of these frameworks, especially SOC 2, don't have a rigid set of requirements. They have a flexible set of control requirements. So often you can adopt some of the ISO philosophies to meet the SOC 2 requirements. And you can consolidate auditors, you can consolidate control frameworks, you can make it a lot cheaper and less effort intensive for yourself. So this is a strategy that we specialize in with our platform as well as our consulting services. We recently saved one company well over $1 million in a single year by consolidating their framework. We've done 2 webinars that you can check out about how we've done that. As our customers talking on those webinars, not us talking, so you can hear directly from them. I think it's really powerful. It's a great efficiency strategy. So I'd highly recommend that. And you can download the single framework strategy white paper where we talk about that. And I'll also link to that in the comments. Anything you want to add on that one, Sawyer?
No, I think you covered it.
Awesome. So those are your 4 action items. And last thing I want to leave you with before we hop out is just the free ISO 27001 resources. We have an ISO 27001 overview. We have a 3-part white paper series on implementing ISO 27001. Sawyer hosts an ISO Bytes series where he takes different ISO frameworks, breaks them out into 5 or 10-minute chunks, and covers the entire framework, all free on YouTube. And then we also have a whole white paper series and video series on the ISO 27001 version 2022 updates that might help simplify that for you. So we'll put links to all of this in the comments, and all of this is absolutely free.
Yeah, and I will add something there. If you're curious about AI and what you may be asked by clients in the future to do, if you are implementing AI, using someone else's AI, building your own, whatever it is, go check out the 42001 ISO Byte series. I really enjoyed doing that one. The standard's not as bulky as 27001, but it's still very dense. There's a lot of thinking that needs to go into it. So if you're doing anything with AI and you think your customers are going to care how you're doing that, I would encourage you to check out that series and go ahead and start thinking about it now.
Excellent. All right. I know that was a whirlwind. I hope that was a valuable 45 minutes for you. If you have any questions on this, just check out risk360.com and we'll be more than happy to help you. And thank you for watching.